Hey, John Gilroy here. How can an organization formed in 1865 impact small satellites? Hit it, Manny.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. We are recording this from the SmallSat convention in lovely downtown Logan, Utah. We talked about many things involving satellites and SmallSats. We decided to bring in some folks from the ITU. Today in the Constellations podcast, we will discuss the regulatory implications of the exponential growth in small satellites. An estimated 26,104 small sats will be launched between 2023 and 2032, according to Novaspace. With so much growth on the horizon, how will regulatory efforts keep pace? What role will regulations play in terms of protecting the spectrum? How can interference be avoided to ensure a level playing field for new and incumbent players? To shed some light on these questions, we have with us today two experts from the International Telecommunications Union. We have Chuen Chern LOO, Head Space Publications and Registration Division, and Ellie Xiuqi WANG, Head Data Treatment Section of Space Service Department, Radiocommunication Bureau. They will share their insights on the role of regulation in the rapidly growing and evolving small satellite world. How is the rapid growth in the small satellite market affecting the role and pace of policy from an International Telecommunication Union perspective?
The small satellite industry is indeed experiencing rapid growth, as evidenced by the increasing number of satellite launches and projects being announced. At the ITU, we are seeing a corresponding rise in satellite network filings submitted to the ITU. This surge in activity highlights the importance of ensuring that regulations keep pace with industry trends. One of the key objectives of ITU's radio regulations is to prevent harmful interference. With this in mind, the role of regulations is becoming all the more important with the growth of the small satellite market. While regulations need to evolve with industry developments, they must also remain sufficiently stable to provide a consistent framework for all stakeholders. Constant changing regulations could create uncertainty and challenges and may even stifle the growth of the industry. Now, the radio regulations are updated through the World Radiocommunication Conference, the WRC, over a 4-year study cycle, during which representatives from all member countries collectively discuss and decide on the rules. Even private companies and academia get to be involved in this study through the study period. As an example of how the regulation was adopted to meet the demands of the small industry, you are probably aware that the ITU regulatory procedures for recording a satellite network in the master register includes the submissions of an advanced publication information, an API, and coordination requests followed by the notification. When the industry felt that the regulatory procedure was too slow for the short project life cycle for small satellites, the WRC in 2019 actually updated the regulations to reduce the time for publishing API from 3 to 2 months, and the time between publication and notification was reduced from 6 to 4 months, thereby reducing the minimum overall time for submitting an API to notification from 9 to 6 months. Another example, when the industry felt that there are satellite projects with short mission durations and that these missions would require additional frequency bands for TT and C, the conference came up with Resolution 32 for short duration missions, whereby these satellite networks have to comply with a host of conditions, including having a period of validity of not more than 3 years, in order to benefit from using newly allocated bands in the 137 and 148 MHz for space operations service without having to go through a lengthy coordination procedure. So we have seen that the change in market dynamics from traditional satellite to growth of small satellites did impact the regulations, and that the regulations did keep up to date with industry development. And I believe that we will continue to do so while ensuring that the overall regulations remain stable.
So, Chuen, what are the specific regulatory challenges posed by the mega constellations such as Starlink and OneWeb?
Mega constellations such as Starlink and OneWeb, while providing benefit to all by widening the coverage of broadband satellite service to a global scale, also present significant regulatory challenges due to their size and complexity, stretching the boundaries of existing regulations. In 2014, when the first wave of these filings first started to arrive at the ITU, we had so much difficulty processing them. Our software was simply not ready to handle filings with that many satellites. Even up to today, we are facing problems with creating publications for some of these filings that are so large that it simply blocks our system. And we have to invent new ways of publishing this information. Now, in terms of regulatory challenges, some specific challenges as follows. These networks are subject to equivalent power flux density limits, EPFD, for the protection of geostationary satellite orbits. These limits were adopted more than 20 years ago when there were no such constellations in operation. Now, ensuring that these limits are effective in preventing harmful interference with geostationary satellites is a major concern still today. On the other hand, there is also a view that the current limits actually overprotect the geostationary satellite systems. Then, for a large constellation, the computation time for the EPFD takes a significant amount of time for execution. Due to this, there's a rather long delay in examining these filings in the ITU. This has created some anxiety in the industry when the operators are not able to have the confirmation that their filings are given a favorable finding until maybe a couple of years later. So this is a real problem that we are facing today. Of course, with a large number of satellites providing broadband internet services, frequency sharing becomes increasingly difficult. New market entrants must navigate a congested spectrum environment, posing challenges for equitable access and interference management. The proliferation of mega constellations increases the risk of space debris. Effective regulations are then needed to address collisions avoidance, debris mitigation, and end-of-life disposal to ensure the long-term sustainability of space operations. Given that this service and coverage provided by these mega constellations are on a global basis, there has been concerns raised about unauthorized operations of non-geostationary satellite orbit Earth stations in some countries, meaning that there are Earth stations transmitting to this mega constellation without a license issued by the respective national authority. Some of these constellations are proposing to implement direct-to-device services, often using frequency bands that are currently allocated only to terrestrial mobile services and not to space services. Such sharing scenario between space and terrestrial services have not been well studied at the ITU, so this use can only be on a non-interference basis. The outcome of this with respect to interference environment is still uncertain. So these are some of the challenges posed by mega constellations that we are facing today.
So there's a lot of challenges there. How can those challenges be addressed effectively by ITU regulations and guidance?
Well, thank you for the question. As previously mentioned, the ITU radio regulations is updated by the WRC every 4 years. And many of these challenges that I mentioned earlier are currently being dealt with at the ITUR study groups and working parties. ITUR Working Party 4A has, in its current work plan, study of the validity of the aggregate EPFD limits and possibly also the single entry limits based on new data and emerging technologies to ensure they adequately address interference concerns without stifling innovation. All concerned parties, the NGSO operators as well as the GSO operators, will certainly be participating actively in these studies. With regard to the time required for processing these EPFD limits, we are already giving qualified favorable to satellite systems that meet all other aspects of the radio regulations and to only review the EPFD examination as a second step. We are currently exploring various technical solutions to help to speed up the process and to seek for better optimization of the execution process. Now, in terms of frequency sharing, ITU can develop more effective frequency sharing mechanisms to accommodate the high density of satellites in mega constellation, and this might include advanced coordination techniques and spectrum management strategies that promote equitable access and reduce interference. Multilateral coordination meetings can be held to ensure that a frequency sharing mechanism is agreed upon and applied by all concerned parties, and to jointly ensure that aggregate limits will be met. To address the risks associated with space debris, the ITU is addressing the issue jointly with other intergovernmental organizations, such as UN COPUOS, and conducting its own study on the sustainability of frequency and orbits, and recognizing the demand for IMT service to be provided also through satellites to complement terrestrial IMT network coverage direct to device. The ITU has put on the agenda 1.13 of the next conference this topic to study and to report and to take a decision. Similarly, concerning the issue of unauthorized operations of non-geostationary satellite orbit Earth stations in some countries, this is also in the agenda of the next conference, and the subject is already being studied by experts in the ITUR study groups. So by adopting these various strategies, the ITU can effectively address the regulatory challenges posed by these mega constellations.
So Ellie, I have a question for you. The ITU has developed a small satellite handbook. Can you tell us why the handbook was created and what purpose it serves?
Thanks for the question here. I believe the rapid growth of the small satellite industry, particularly over the last decade, motivated the creation of the ITUR handbook on small satellites. The launch of the first artificial Earth small satellites in 1957 marked the beginning of the space race and led to the development of larger satellites over the following decades. However, the increasing demand of radio frequency spectrum and orbit slots, along with technological advancements, has driven a dramatic rise in small satellite development. Small satellites often have lower financial and technical barriers, making them accessible and affordable for startups, universities, and research institutions. The modular and standardized design, rapid build and launch cycles, lower latency from lower orbits, coupled with seamless global coverage in constellations, offer significant advantages for easy expansion and prompt replenishment of satellite fleets with innovative technologies. This evolution provides wider and easier access to space services for all countries. Governments and companies right now are increasingly developing small satellite projects for a wide range of applications. In addition to traditional use like data communication, Earth exploration, space research, and satellite navigation, these projects now support environmental monitoring, education, agriculture, forestry, disaster recovery, scientific experiments, deep space exploration, and testing innovative technologies and national defense. So they also facilitate integration with 5G, 6G, MT, satellite internet access, the Internet of Things, smart cities, business intelligence, debris mitigation, and many other complex space tasks. Future advancements in AI and machine learning are expected to bring even more capabilities to small satellite technology. Recognizing the rapid change and the global trend in small satellite technology, which benefits both developed and developing economies, the ITU Radiocommunication Assembly proposed to have comprehensive training and operational guidance for small satellites initiated by China in 2019. This effort acknowledged the growing number of small satellites and their role in providing affordable access to limited spectrum and orbit resources for new entrants in space, as mentioned above. It emphasized the need for all satellites, including small satellites, nanosatellites, picosatellites, to use radio frequencies in accordance with radio regulations and ITUR recommendations to avoid harmful interference with other satellite systems. To address this need and instruction made by the Radiocommunication Assembly, the work has been done in the Working Party 4A to develop a handbook on small satellites since 2019, and with contributions from qualified ITU staff and a wide range of industry experts. The first version of the handbook was released in 2023 in July, and this standalone ITUR handbook serves as a valuable reference tool for the small satellite industry, especially offering detailed guidance on ITU regulations, frequency allocations, and regulatory procedures to facilitate the submission of ITU filings for small satellites. Overall, the ITOR Small Satellite Handbook bridges technical and regulatory aspects supporting the development, deployment, and management of small satellite systems according to the radio regulations. So feel free to review and refer to it when preparing ITU filings or having questions related to ITU regulations.
Well, Ellie, that's interesting. Well, now that your handbook has been published, what is the next step to make sure that the handbook continues to be relevant?
Okay, given the rapid growth in the small satellite industry, we often find that once we have completed a piece of documentation, the industry and the underlying technology has moved ahead already. Similarly for the handbook, once it's published, it risks becoming obsolete by the rapid change in the industry. Although regulations are updated every 4 years, each new submission brings new aspects in the application of regulations that may not have been previously considered or documented. Understanding this rapid change and the need for the handbook to stay relevant, we maintain the dedicated webpage for the Small Satellite Handbook. This page will be continuously updated with new content to supplement the handbook once there is, and we continue to encourage contributions from all actors in the small satellite industry for inclusion in the future updates. Proposals from ITR members should be submitted to the Working Party 4A directly, and for non-ITUR entities, they can submit their submissions to the specific mailbox, smallsathb@itu.int. This is available also online. These submissions will be prepared as input for the Working Party 4A, and once it's adopted by the Working Party 4A, the updates will be made available online as soon as possible, and the handbook will remain freely downloadable. In this way, the handbook will serve as a foundational resource for newcomers to learn about small satellite regulations and industry trends. It will be continually complemented with up-to-date information and insights, ensuring its ongoing relevance to the small satellite industry. So I would like to take this opportunity to call for continuous global contributions to the ITR handbook on small satellites.
Chuen, with so many constellations launching and other users such as military and terrestrial providers competing for the same scarce resource, how can the ITU ensure equitable access to the radio spectrum?
Well, we have to first recognize that spectrum is indeed a scarce resource. We don't make spectrum anymore. Whatever is there is limited. Therefore, its allocations must be managed with great care to ensure that all users, whether they are satellite operators, military entities, or terrestrial providers, have equitable access to meet their needs. For any new or increased demand that has been identified in advance for spectrum for a specific service, the ITUR will conduct studies on the forecasted demand for bandwidth, identifies possible frequency bands for consideration, and conduct sharing studies on the impact to incumbent services. Here are several strategies that the ITU employs to address this challenge. Spectrum allocation. With advanced planning for the bandwidth required for a specific service, the ITU, through the WRC process, allocates blocks of spectrum to different services and imposes conditions on the utilization of these spectrums depending on results of sharing studies. Notification process. Now, all satellite networks using radio frequency will have to be notified to the ITU, starting with either an API or a coordination request. In this way, it is clear to all on the occupancy of the orbit and frequency. A new system should take them into account. Coordination process. Effective coordination processes are essential to manage competing demands for spectrum. The radio regulations contain specific coordination procedures between different users and services to prevent interference, so that all parties have access to the spectrum they require as much as possible. Spectrum efficiency. The radio regulations promote the efficient use of spectrum. The ITU encourages technologies and methods that make best use of available spectrum, enhancing efficiency. Regular reviews and updates. We have talked about the WRC, how they actually meet every 4 years to update the regulations. So this process allows us to regularly review and update the regulations, the table of frequency allocations, such that the frequencies available to the service to the users who needs it most. So by implementing these strategies, the ITU aims to ensure that spectrum is allocated and used in a manner that supports the needs of all users.
So what role does the ITU play in terms of ensuring the sustainable use of frequency and orbit resources?
Now, the ITU, we can say that it is a highly effective intergovernmental organization in enforcing regulations on frequency usage. The ITU has recognized the need to ensure the sustainable use of the limited frequency and orbit resources. The ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, which is the highest body of the ITU, has adopted in Bucharest in 2022 Resolution 219 instructing the Radiocommunication Assembly to perform the necessary studies on the issue of increasing use of radio frequency spectrum and associated orbit resources in non-geostationary satellite orbits and the long-term sustainability of these resources. So the Radiocommunication Assembly met in 2023 and adopted Resolution ITU-R74, which instructs the study groups to conduct technical activities, including those on interference assessment and mitigation techniques among non-GSO systems in support of the long-term sustainability. It should be noted that ITU's existing recommendation, which is ITU-R S1003-2, Environmental Protection of the Geostationary Satellite Orbit, has been effective in making the geostationary satellite orbit relatively free of debris, despite it being only a recommendation and not a regulation. Therefore, this new resolution ITU-R74 from the Radiocommunication Assembly also resolves to conduct studies towards the development of a possible new recommendation providing guidance on safe and efficient de-orbit and or disposal strategies and methodologies for non-geostationary satellite orbit space stations after the end of their life. While detailed studies are being carried out at the ITU-R study groups, at the same time, we at the Radiocommunication Bureau, we are also doing our part to advance on the work on this resolution. We had sent a circular letter in March of this year inviting member states, satellite operators, space agencies, etc. to share their strategies being used or to be used for the post-mission de-orbit and disposal of non-geostationary satellite orbit space stations. And we have received a number of valuable inputs, which we have published them all on our Space Sustainability Gateway webpage. We are organizing a Space Sustainability Forum 2024 on the 10th to 11th of September 2024, which will convene top leaders and subject matter experts to present, discuss, and dive deeply into the policies, best practices, guidelines, strategies to ensure that space remains accessible and sustainable for the future space activities envisioned today and in the future.
How big a problem are cases of interference today, and what is the outlook for the future with the increase in the number of constellations?
In terms of harmful interference, the ITU is made aware of it only when there is an official complaint registered with the ITU in the application of Article 15 of the radio regulations. In terms of statistics, we have still relatively few cases of reported instances of harmful interference in most frequency bands, although there are issues in some specific bands. To put it into perspective, according to our statistics, in 2023, 99.94% of registered spectrum are free from reported harmful interference. For reported interference cases, we could make use of the space radio monitoring facilities, for which we have signed MOU with countries like Brazil, Oman, Belarus, China, Germany, Korea, Pakistan, and Vietnam to geolocate the source of harmful interference. The Bureau has also convened meetings among concerned administration to try to resolve these interference issues. Of course, the prominent issue today is concerning interference to the Radio Navigation Satellite Service, the RNSS, and the Bureau and the Radio Regulations Board are taking this issue very seriously, and we remind all administrations to apply the necessary measures at the national level to avoid the commercialization, proliferation, and the use of illegal transmitters, and to take actions to prevent and mitigate harmful interference affecting RNSS. In terms of mega constellation, if we simply count the number of satellites in the filings that we have received over the years, we arrived at some mind-boggling figure of millions of satellites that will be launched over the next 7 years. However, market dynamics is likely to limit the coexistence of all these satellite constellations in the first place. It's like the number of paper filings that we have received for geostationary satellite networks in the late 1990s. Subsequently, we found that the actual number of geostationary satellites that will finally launch remain realistic and manageable. Given the significant financial investment in these mega constellations, I would expect that these operators will well respect the regulatory framework, coordinate with each other to ensure coexistence during operations, and work together in the ITUR to improve the regulatory framework as needed to ensure an interference-free environment for all as we move forward.
Chuen, how are the cases of interference mitigated or resolved today for small satellites?
Well, the best way to mitigate interference is actually through prevention. And that is why the radio regulations allocate spectrum to specific services with defined operating conditions requiring a procedure of registration of frequency assignments, coordination with potentially affected administration before notification and bringing into use. By making use of specific frequency assignments over specific service areas, it is often possible to prevent interference before it occurs. However, should there be an occurrence of harmful interference, the affected administration should submit the relevant information to the Bureau and follow the procedure spelled out in Article 15 of the radio regulations. Now, the Bureau has put in place a reporting system online to facilitate the ease of making such reports, ensuring swift action upon receiving such reports. A network of space radio monitoring facilities is in place when required to geolocate the source of harmful interference. So, to date, we have not received any significant reports of harmful interference from small satellites. However, one worrying trend is the use of number 4.4 of the radio regulation, which is using bands that are not in accordance with the table of frequency allocations. We have unfortunately been receiving many such filings. Some are for experimental purpose, but there are some that may be using them for commercial systems. So this is a dangerous trend. And we have reported this to the conference. So the WRC has expressed collectively their concern of this trend and instructed the Bureau to follow up on this issue and make such utilization transparent by providing statistics on our website. So the Bureau is also doing its part by writing to administration whenever there is an API received with potential non-compliance of the table of frequency allocation, to ensure that the administration understands fully the implication of using frequency bands that are not in accordance with the table of frequency allocation. So this is spelled out very clearly to them right at the beginning of the filing process.
Chuen, how do you see new technologies such as artificial intelligence impacting the use of small satellites, and will this require new regulations?
Well, unlike traditional satellites, which requires decades for new technologies to be flight-proven before they're actually utilized in space, small satellites have shown that they can embrace new technologies rapidly, within months in some cases. There are many new technologies being explored at the moment, of course, including artificial intelligence and machine learning. We are seeing this being implemented into many new space technologies. For example, due to the scarcity of the bandwidth, using AI, machine learning on board a satellite can help to analyze the huge amount of data that the satellites can collect and to select which data is finally transmitted to Earth, thereby optimizing the use of frequency. And this is useful for the ITU in the sense that we are really making it efficient use of frequency. AI can also help to optimize mission and to control large satellite constellations, significantly reducing the workload of ground operators. Some are considering the use of AI in cognitive radio to select frequency bands that are free or available. However, AI cannot be allowed to be so autonomous that it starts to make use of frequency outside of the radio regulations, or maneuvers satellite constellations in such a way that contradict filed parameters that could create chaos in the management of frequencies and orbits. Therefore, I firmly believe that regulations need to continue to keep pace with these rapid advancements in technology.
As you look at the next few years, How do you see spectrum regulation evolving with the increase in small satellites in orbit?
Well, with more small satellites being launched into orbits, there is an increasing demand for spectrum for space services, even as more and more spectrums are being carved out for terrestrial service like INT, which is 5G, 6G, and so on. Now, if we look at the agenda items adopted for the next WRC in 2027, 3/4 of the agendas are actually concerning space services. So we can see that the trend now is towards importance being adopted for space services. So small satellites can use the same frequency allocations as for other satellites. However, the specific characteristics of small satellites should be taken into account when we are doing these studies. With more players, there would be a greater need for aggregate limits, and multilateral meetings will be needed to convene, to coordinate, and to agree on the use of this spectrum. The regulations could assign a more significant role to the ITU Radiocommunication Bureau to assist and facilitate the coordination process. There may be a need for monitoring. Therefore, the regulations could advance to say that monitoring is essential to validate the power limits, to validate the power levels as part of their submissions. So we see also recent trend for satellite direct-to-device service, suborbital flights, etc. So we are starting to see the blurring of the separation of spectrum between terrestrial and space services, and regulations will have to adapt to this change. In terms of orbit utilization, the conference has adopted resolutions that requires the ITU to validate the deployment of Constellation by milestone and to verify the orbital tolerance of deployed satellites. But it's only applicable to some specific bands and services. So to really manage well the orbit utilization, given the increasing number of satellites in orbit, this may have to be extended to all satellites in all frequency bands and services. So in summary, regulations should continue to evolve to ensure the rational, economical, equitable and effective use of the spectrum, and to ensure that spectrum is available for those who really need it for solving world problems.
Great. I'd like to thank our guests, Chuen Chern LOO, Head Space Publications and Registration Division, and Ellie Xiuqi Wang, Head Data Treatment Section of Space Service Department, Radiocommunication Bureau, from the International Telecommunications Union.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.